The emergency session of the Galactic Cartography Council had been called without warning, without precedent, and according to the expression on Senior Archivist Vrenek's triple-lidded face, without any acceptable explanation for what his research division had uncovered. 47 delegates sat in the curved tiers of the conclave hall on Primex Station, their varied physiologies betraying universal signs of unease. Feathers flattened, chromatophores dimmed to neutral gray, mandibles locked shut, because on every delegate's interface floated the same document, and every delegate was having the same quiet, creeping crisis of understanding. "Archivist Vrenek," said High Consul Dareth of the Pollution Sovereignty, her resonance organs vibrating at a frequency that translated as barely controlled alarm. "You are asking this council to believe that the humans knew, before first contact, before our deep-range probes entered their system, before we even classified their world as a candidate for observation. You are saying they already knew we existed." Vrenek's neck frills rose slowly. "I am not asking you to believe anything, High Consul. I am asking you to look at the evidence, because the evidence does not particularly care whether we find it comfortable." He expanded the holographic display until it filled the center of the chamber. Dense columns of data, annotated in 17 languages, none of them galactic standard. When the Terran Integration Bureau gave our archivists access to their historical record as part of the Transparency Accords, we expected the usual: primitive resource conflicts, agricultural records, rudimentary astronomical charts showing a species just beginning to look upward. Vrenek paused. What we found instead required 3 years of verification, 4 independent translation teams, and 1 complete psychological evaluation of my senior researcher, who I am told is now fine. A low ripple of uncertain sounds moved through the chamber. The humans have been producing detailed, documented, richly imagined depictions of galactic civilizations for over 200 of their years. He let that land. Let it sit in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Not vague mythology, not religious cosmology about sky gods. I mean technical speculation. Organized frameworks of interstellar societies, faster-than-light travel, alien biology, first contact protocols, diplomatic structures, and the specific social and psychological challenges of a species encountering beings utterly unlike themselves. He gestured to the floating wall of data, thousands of them, produced by ordinary citizens, shared freely, some read by millions of their own people. "Coincidence," said Delegate Braxer of the Mantheid Collective flatly. His compound eyes reflected the data without blinking. "Pattern recognition imposed on random creative output. Their brains are known to seek faces in noise. They would construct galactic societies in fiction just as naturally as they construct animals in cloud formations." "That was my initial assessment as well," Vrenek said. "Then we found the cartography. Another expansion of the display. Star maps now, rendered in old human art styles, in the flat pigment-on-fiber medium they had used before digital reproduction. Beautiful, in an alien and unsettling way. This was produced approximately 160 of their years ago by a human who worked as an illustrator for what they called a pulp magazine. Entertainment media, cheap and disposable." Vrenek highlighted a section of the illustrated star map. "This cluster here. The humans called it the Reach of the Seven Sisters because of how it appeared from their world. They invented an interstellar civilization living within it. They gave it a name. They wrote hundreds of stories set within it over several decades." He paused for effect. "The civilization they invented traded in rare heavy elements, maintained strict non-interference protocols regarding pre-contact worlds, and had been engaged in a low-level territorial dispute with a neighboring collective for approximately 300 years. The chamber was very quiet. "The Sirath continuance," said Fleet Admiral Korvan slowly, from the upper tier. His scarred mandibles were very still. "You are describing the Sirath continuance, a civilization we did not map for outside knowledge until the Pelusian probes reached that region 40 years ago." "Yes," Vrenek said, "we are." The silence that followed was a different quality of silence. It was the silence of a room full of beings collectively revising their understanding of something they thought they had already understood. "There is more," Vrenek said, because of course there was. "The non-interference concept, the foundational ethical principle of the Galactic Accord, the rule that pre-contact civilizations must not be interfered with until they achieve independent interstellar travel. The principle we spent 4 centuries arguing about before codifying it into galactic law. The humans invented it, independently, wrote it into their fiction, debated it, in their fiction, extensively, with great philosophical rigor, approximately 90 years before we made first contact with them." He looked around the chamber. "They called it by different names and different stories, but the concept was identical. They arrived at our most cherished ethical framework through imagination alone. Delegate Shulan of the Keeleran observers, who had been silent throughout, now shifted in her cradle seat. Her chromatophores flickered through a rapid sequence of colors that the translators rendered as something between profound confusion and reluctant awe. "How?" she asked. "How does a species with no contact, no evidence, no external stimulus, arrive at accurate models of what they have never seen?" Vrenich folded his primary appendages. "We asked them." Every head in the chamber turned. "After we discovered the scope of what their historical archive contained, we requested a meeting with the humans who study this tradition. They call them scholars of speculative fiction. The woman we spoke to was named Dr. Amara Ose Mensah. She holds a chair at an institution called the University of Lagos. She was, I will note for the record, entirely unsurprised by our questions." He pulled up an audio-visual record. She said, and I am quoting exactly from the translation, "You have to understand that humans have always done this. We have always looked at the dark and populated it. We have always looked at the unknown and asked what if. Not because we expected to be right, not because we had evidence, but because the not knowing was unbearable to us. The darkness between stars was not empty to us. It never was. We put things there because we needed to, and sometimes, apparently, we were right." Fleet Admiral Corvan leaned forward. She was not alarmed by the fact that her species had essentially been pre-imagining galactic reality for 2 centuries without knowing it. "No," Vrenich said. She seemed rather pleased. She said, and again I am quoting, "We always hoped. We just never had confirmation." Then she asked if we had read any of it. The fiction. She seemed to think we would enjoy it. Another ripple through the chamber. This one carrying a different frequency. Not alarm. Something more complicated. "The implications," began High Consul Dareth slowly, "of a species that maps the unknown not through observation, but through imagination, and arrives at accurate conclusions through sheer, creative pressure, are significant." Vrenich agreed. "Yes. How accurate?" Braxor asked. His voice had lost its earlier flatness. "Across the body of work, how statistically accurate are their imagined civilizations compared to what we have since confirmed actually exists?" Vrenich pulled up the final section of his report. "Our analysts spent 8 months on this question. The honest answer is that the accuracy is not the interesting part. The interesting part is the variance. When humans are wrong, they are wrong in ways that reveal the edges of their natural intuition. When they are right in ways that suggest they were not guessing at all, but reaching for something just beyond their perception." He paused. "Their developmental psychologists have studied this extensively. Every human child is born with it. The feeling of standing at the edge of what is known and feeling pulled toward what is not, rather than frightened by it. Most species, as they mature, lose that tolerance. The unknown becomes anxiety. Anxiety becomes fear. Fear becomes the instinct to stay within the known and defend it." His frills rose. "Humans went the other way. Across the whole span of their recorded history, in every culture that survived long enough to leave a record, they cultivated the ability to stand at the edge of the unknown and feel not fear but hunger. They treated the unanswered question not as a threat, but as an invitation, and so they reached into the dark and filled it with what they hoped was there." The chamber had gone very still again. "They were not ready for us," said a quiet voice from the lower tier. Delegate Imael of the Vrethian Compact, ancient and slow-moving, her carapace worn thin at the edges. She rarely spoke at full council sessions. When she did, others listened. "We debated that for years before first contact. Whether they were ready, whether first contact would shatter them, whether the knowledge that they were not alone would break something fundamental in their sense of self." She made a sound the translators rendered as a long, tired exhale. "And it turns out they had already done it to themselves. Hundreds of years ago, they had already imagined us, mourned the versions of us that were frightening, celebrated the versions of us that were kind, grieved for the versions of fictional humanity that failed the moment, and cheered for the versions that rose to it." She was quiet for a moment. "They had rehearsed. For centuries they had rehearsed." "That," said Fleet Admiral Corvan, "is either the most extraordinary thing I have ever heard, or the most terrifying." "Why would it be terrifying?" Delegate Shulan asked. Corvan was quiet for a moment. "Because it means they were never passive. It means that every moment since their first astronomers looked up and understood that those lights were other suns, some part of their civilization was already reaching toward what might live around them, not waiting to be found, not hoping to be contacted." He looked at the star maps still floating in the center of the chamber. The old illustrated ones, made by a human hand holding pigment on fiber, made for cheap entertainment, made because the darkness was unbearable and the stars were never empty. Already reaching, Braxor stood. It was an unusual gesture for a mantheid, a species that conducted its most serious disagreements from a seated position. That he rose now meant the objection forming behind his compound eyes was one he considered foundational. Archivist, I want to be precise about what I am challenging, because I do not think you are lying and I do not think your data is fabricated. I think you are making an interpretive error of extraordinary magnitude. He spread his forward appendages. You are attributing intention to coincidence. The humans are a pattern-seeking species on a death world. They evolved to predict. A creature that cannot anticipate what is in the dark gets eaten by what is in the dark. Of course they imagined what lived in the stars. Of course some of those imaginations were accurate. If you generate enough guesses about enough topics for enough centuries, statistical reality demands that some of them cluster around the truth. You are treating noise as signal. That argument, Vrenek said, with the patience of someone who had been waiting for it, does not survive the linguistics. He pulled up a new section of the archive. Dense human text, scrolling slowly, underlined and annotated by his research team in the precise notation of academic analysis. When any species generates random creative output over a long period, the errors are distributed evenly. You see over-imagination and under-imagination in roughly equal proportion. A species that fantasizes about alien civilizations through pure noise should produce stories about civilizations that are too vast, too unified, too simple, too alien, too familiar, in rough balance. He paused. The human archive does not show even distribution. It shows systematic clustering. Their errors have a direction. They consistently underestimate scale and consistently overestimate internal conflict. They imagine civilizations smaller than they are and more fractured than they are. Those are not random errors. Those are the errors of a species projecting their own experience outward, of a species that knows, on some level, what it feels like to be a civilization, and is asking what another one would feel like. His frills spread wide, a gesture the translators flagged as emphatic assertion. That is not noise, Delegate Braxor. That is the shape of genuine inquiry. They were not guessing. They were reasoning. With no data, for 200 years, in every entertainment medium available to them, billions of ordinary humans were engaged in the largest sustained act of collective reasoning about the unknown that this galaxy has ever recorded. And we almost missed it because we filed it under fiction. Braxor sat down slowly. He did not speak again for some time. It was Korvan who broke the quiet, and his voice had the particular flatness of a military mind running calculations it did not especially want to complete. Archivist, the non-interference principle. Tell me how they actually arrived at it, because I need to understand not just that they invented it, but the reasoning that got them there. Vrenek was quiet for a moment, choosing where to begin. Their fiction contains what scholars of the tradition call first contact scenarios, stories specifically about what happens when an advanced civilization encounters a less advanced one. They wrote thousands of these, and the debate running through all of them, the central moral tension they returned to again and again, across generations, across cultures, across the full breadth of their civilization's intellectual development, was always the same question. What do you owe a species that cannot yet speak to you as an equal? Do you intervene to prevent their suffering? Do you share your knowledge to accelerate their development? Or do you stand back and let them find their own way, because the finding is part of what makes them who they are? That is precisely the argument that divided the Accord for 3 centuries, Dareth said softly. Yes, and the humans resolved it in their fiction approximately 90 years before we resolved it in law. Not because they had our history, not because they had our data, but because they had the question, and they had the imagination to follow it to its honest conclusion. Vrenek looked around the chamber. They decided, in their stories, that the answer was restraint, that the most respectful thing a powerful civilization could do for a developing one was to leave it room to become itself. They reached that conclusion through moral reasoning alone, conducted in public, through entertainment, debated by ordinary citizens who were just trying to tell each other good stories. That is not a coincidence, Imael said quietly. That is a civilization thinking. Korvan stood. I want to speak to one of them. The chamber stirred. Several delegates exchanged looks. It was not procedurally irregular exactly. The Transparency Accords permitted direct consultation with Terran representatives on matters arising from archival review. But the casual directness of the request felt strange in a chamber that had spent the last hour collectively reassessing its understanding of what humanity was. That can be arranged, Vrenek said. In fact, I anticipated this request. He opened a communications channel that had been held in standby since the session began. Dr. Osai Mensah agreed to be available. I told her this council might have further questions. You told her about the session, Dareth said. I told her we were presenting our findings. She said, and I quote, "Good. It's about time." The holographic display shifted, and there she was. Dr. Amara Osai Mensah, seated at what appeared to be a desk covered in physical books. The old kind. The kind made from processed plant fiber that humans had kept producing long after better technologies existed, apparently because they found something in the object itself that a digital copy could not replicate. She was small by human standards, elderly by the reckoning of a species whose maximum lifespan was still startlingly brief compared to most galactic civilizations. She looked at the assembled council with the calm, attentive expression of someone who had spent a career sitting across from students who thought they had found a flaw in her argument. "Council?" she said. "I understand you have been reading our homework." The translators rendered this accurately. Several delegates did not know what to make of it. Korvan leaned forward. "Dr. Osai Mensah, I am Fleet Admiral Korvan. I have a direct question, and I would prefer a direct answer." "Those are my favorite kind," she said. "Did your civilization know? Not in some loose collective subconscious sense. Not metaphorically. Did anyone, at any point, have actual evidence that other civilizations existed? And keep that evidence from the public while your fiction writers filled in the gap?" Osei Mensah was quiet for a moment. Then she made a sound that the translators identified as a short, genuine laugh. "No, Admiral. I appreciate the suspicion, truly, it would make for a better story. But no, we were not secretly informed. Nobody hid a signal from us. There was no shadow council sitting on alien transmissions while ordinary humans wrote science fiction in blissful ignorance of the real truth." She folded her hands on the desk. "The real truth is more interesting and, I think, more unsettling for your purposes. We did it without any of that. We looked at an empty sky and decided it couldn't possibly be empty. And then we spent 2 centuries imagining everything that might be in it. And some of us were right, and all of us were reaching." "Why?" Korvan pressed. "That is the question I cannot answer from the archive. Why maintain it for so long? Why across so many generations, so many cultures, so many wildly different human societies with almost nothing else in common? Why does every human civilization that reaches a certain level of complexity turn its eyes upward and start imagining what lives out there?" Osei Mensah looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was quieter. "Because we are mortal, Admiral. We live, at the outside, about 100 years. We watch everyone we love die. We die ourselves. And we look up at stars that have burned for billions of years, and we understand, in our bones, that we are very small and very brief." She paused. "Most species, I gather, find that thought crushing. It produces fear, withdrawal, the instinct to protect and consolidate what you have, because everything ends and nothing outside is safe." She tilted her head slightly. "Humans went the other direction. We decided that if we were brief, we would be curious. That if we were small, we would imagine large. That if we were alone, we would reach out so hard and so far, and with such determination that maybe, eventually, something would reach back." Her voice was very steady. "The fiction was never really about aliens, Admiral. It was about us. It was about a species trying to convince itself that the universe was worth the grief of being alive in it. That the darkness was populated. That there were others. That we were not one small candle burning alone in a room with no walls and no end." Nobody in the chamber spoke. Several delegates had, without appearing to notice, gone very still in the particular way of beings processing something that has just reorganized a foundational assumption. "And then," she continued, with something in her expression that the translators flagged as too complex for direct emotional mapping, "we turned out to be right, and you came. And the candle was not alone." She looked at her hands for a moment. "We cried, you know, when first contact was confirmed. Not just the people directly involved. Billions of humans cried, because the thing we had been reaching toward for 200 years had reached back. Because the stories were true." She looked up. "Not the specific stories, not all the details, but the essential thing. The thing all the stories were really saying. That space is full, that we are not alone. That was true. It turned out to be completely, absolutely, overwhelmingly true." Vrenich, who had presented his findings with methodical precision for the past hour, made a sound that was not part of any presentation he had prepared. It was a small sound, involuntary. The translators could not render it exactly, but several delegates recognized it as the sound a being makes when it encounters something it did not have a category for, and discovers, unexpectedly, that the category it needs is not intellectual at all. Dareth spoke carefully. "Dr. Osai Mensah, We spent 400 years deciding whether to contact your species. The debate was, in retrospect, considerable. There were factions within this council that argued you were not psychologically prepared, that the knowledge of a populated galaxy would produce civilizational instability, that we would be doing you damage we could not repair. Osei Mensa nodded slowly. I know. We found those debates in your archive after the Accords opened the historical record both ways. Our scholars have been reading your council transcripts with considerable interest. A small pause, and with, I will confess, a certain amount of fondness. You were genuinely worried about us. That is, if I may say so, very sweet. Braxer made a sound that his own delegates had never heard from him before. It took a moment for even his own translator to categorize it. It was, the device eventually concluded, an involuntary sound of being caught caring about something you had publicly claimed not to care about. What concerns me, said Korvan, pressing forward because he was a military mind and this was the pressure point, is the preparation you mentioned. Delegate Imael used the word rehearsed. Dr. Osei Mensa, your people rehearsed this moment for 200 years. My question is what else you rehearsed? Because in my experience, the civilizations that think carefully about first contact also think carefully about what comes after, about negotiation, about where power lies, about what concessions cost and what they're worth. His eyes were steady. Did your fiction writers think about that too? Osei Mensa met his gaze directly. Yes, she said simply. Extensively. And the conclusion most of them reached, she said, is that the species which comes to the table having already imagined every possible version of the conversation has a significant advantage over the species that arrives believing it is dealing with something entirely new. A pause. We have been imagining this conversation, Admiral, in thousands of variations for 200 years. We have imagined the versions where we were naive and were taken advantage of. We imagined the versions where we were aggressive and were destroyed. We imagined the versions where we were too eager and gave too much, too fast. We imagined the versions where we were too guarded and closed ourselves off from something extraordinary. She let that settle. We have already, in fiction, made every mistake available to us. And we have already, in fiction, grieved the consequences of each one. Her voice did not change in tone, but it carried a weight now that the chamber felt distinctly. We do not intend to make them in reality. The silence that followed was of a different quality than any silence the session had produced so far. It was not the silence of shock or processing. It was the silence of delegates from 47 civilizations understanding simultaneously that they were not, in fact, sitting across from a young species feeling its way through its first galactic conversations. They were sitting across from a species that had been studying this conversation since before any of them had decided to have it. We spent 400 years, Dareth said quietly, deciding whether to contact you. We know, Osei Mensa said gently, and the entire time, we were writing stories about it. Yes. Dareth was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed in a way the translators could not fully capture. Something between humility and something that might have been shame. She did not look at Vrennik. She looked at Osei Mensa directly. Did any of them, she asked, imagine that we would be afraid of you? Not of what you might do. Afraid of what you represented. Afraid that a species could be so certain the universe was worth loving that it shamed the rest of us for our hesitation. Osei Mensa was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Vrennik. The Octavia passage, she said. Read it to them. Vrennik reached into his documents without hesitation. He had flagged it during the 3rd month of analysis. He had read it many times since, always finding something new in it, and finding each time that it had not lost any of its weight. He read it now into the record of the council chamber, translated from a human language called English, from a story written 112 years before first contact by a human named Octavia, who had lived her whole life on a single unremarkable planet and had never once stopped looking up. Perhaps the hardest thing to accept was not that the stars were full of life. It was that the life in the stars had been just as afraid as we were. That across all that distance, in all those civilizations we had imagined and hoped for and dreamed of, they too had been looking out at the dark and wondering what was there, wondering if it would be kind, wondering if the voices they thought they heard were real or only the sound of their own longing. We had thought the galaxy was a place we needed to be ready for. It turned out the galaxy had needed to be ready for us. He closed the document. Osei Mensa did not speak immediately. She looked at her hands, then at the council, then somewhere beyond the screen, at something only she could see. I read that story when I was 9 years old, she said at last. It was the first story that made me understand what this tradition was really for. Not entertainment, not escapism, Not even hope, exactly. She paused. Permission. It gave us permission to believe that the reaching was worth it. That whatever was out there, we were allowed to want to find it. Her voice was quiet now, careful with something fragile. She was right, wasn't she? The writer. About all of it. Yes, Vrenich said. She was. The chamber held its silence for a long moment. Every being in it was sitting with the same weight. The weight of a species that had spent 200 years imagining this exact room, and had hoped, with a ferocity that apparently bordered on compulsion, that when the moment finally came, the beings filling it would be worth the wait. Finally, old Delegate Imael made a sound that the translators, after a long pause, rendered as something close to a laugh. Not the uncomfortable sound Braxor had made earlier, something older and warmer and more tired. Well, she said softly, looking at the star maps still floating in the center of the chamber, at the human hand that had drawn them, at the darkness they had filled with hope instead of fear. I suppose we had better be. On the screen, Dr. Osai Mensah smiled. It was a particular kind of human smile. The translators, by now, had enough context to identify it. It was the smile of someone who had read the ending of a story they loved so many times they knew it by heart, and had found, against all reasonable expectation, that the real version was better. You already are, she said. You came. That was always the most important part. The session continued for many hours after that. There were protocols to discuss, archive access procedures to formalize, a proposal from Delegate Julian that human speculative fiction be formally added to the Galactic Cultural Archive as a primary historical document rather than an entertainment category, which passed with only 2 dissenting votes. There were careful, circling conversations about what the human body of work implied for first contact protocols with other pre-contact species, conversations that would eventually reshape galactic policy in ways that would take decades to fully manifest. But Fleet Admiral Korvan, drafting notes on his command interface as the session wound down, found himself returning again and again to the illustrated star map, the cheap, disposable, beautiful old thing, made by a human artist for an audience of ordinary people who had no way of knowing they were mapping something real. He had called it, earlier in the session, the work of a species already reaching. That was accurate as far as it went. But sitting with it now, in the quiet aftermath, he understood it differently. It was not preparation exactly. It was hunger. It was the refusal of a creature that lived only 100 years to accept that the universe was too large to reach across. It was a species that looked at the impossible distance between stars and responded not with surrender, but with imagination so fierce and sustained and collectively maintained that it had, across 2 centuries, accidentally told the truth. He thought about civilizations that had achieved faster-than-light travel, 1,000-year lifespans, technologies that bent the physical laws of the universe, and had still spent 4 centuries arguing about whether to knock on a door that, it turned out, had been waiting for the knock since before any of them had raised their hand. He thought about a 9-year-old human reading a story by a woman named Octavia, and understanding, for the first time, what it meant to look up. He did not have a word, in his own language, for what he felt. He checked the human archive, which his interface had remained connected to throughout the session. He searched for the concept, the feeling of realizing that something you had underestimated was not merely more than you thought, but had been quietly, patiently, stubbornly hoping you would figure that out all along. The archive returned a result immediately. The humans, of course, had a word for it. They had a word for almost everything. Several words for the things that mattered most. Whole traditions built around naming the feelings that other species had never thought to name, because they had never thought to look for them. The word was wonder. He sat with it for a long time. Outside the station's observation ports, the stars burned the same as they always had. Indifferent, ancient, impossibly far away. The same stars a human artist had drawn by hand over a century ago, on cheap paper, for cheap entertainment, because the darkness between them was unbearable, and the only answer they had ever found was to imagine something living there. They had been right. Korvan closed the archive. He did not begin his report. Not yet. He simply sat in the quiet of the session's ending, a soldier from a civilization that had crossed the galaxy and seen wonders without number, and felt, for perhaps the first time in his long career, that he had underestimated what wonder actually was. A species of brief, mortal, perpetually grieving creatures had looked up at the dark and decided, against all evidence, that it was full, and the galaxy, as it turned out, had spent centuries becoming worthy of the hope. If stories like this resonate with you, you are watching Sci-Fi Story Extra channel. For more thought-provoking and captivating stories, stay tuned.